Well, welcome, good night, Ayintuta. Thank you for connecting uh, for this event, for this very interesting panel. My name is Americo Mendoza Mori. I'm the Quechua program coordinator at the University of Pennsylvania. And tonight we are having one of the panels promoted by the Indigenous Latinx Project, supported by the Quechua program, with the goal of providing a space for individuals from the Latinx community to explore and discuss experiences, engage and learn about their culture, language, and create a community in a virtual setting. And for tonight, the panel is called Exploring Indigenous Latinx Identities. Before we start, we also want to do a land acknowledgement. I know we are connected from different places, but we recognize and acknowledge that the University of Pennsylvania stands on the indigenous territory known as Lenape-Hoking, the traditional homelands of the Lenape, also called Lenni Lenape or Delaware Indians. These are the people who, during the 1680s, negotiated with William Penn to facilitate the founding of the colony of Pennsylvania. Their descendants today include the Delaware Tribe and Delaware Nation of Oklahoma, the Nanticoke Lenni Lenape, Ramapough Lenape, and Powhatan of New Jersey, and the Munsee Delaware of Ontario. And regardless where you are, that we are on indigenous land. And now I'm going to pass it on to this event's moderator, Andrea Huacachino, a Ph.D. student at the University of Pennsylvania.
Hi, welcome all. I'll be your moderator, Andrea Huacachino, and I would like to start off by introducing our panelists. First, we have Frances Montevilla, who is a first-year student from Alexandria, Virginia, attending the University of Virginia and majoring in politics. She's of Bolivian heritage with parents and grandparents, and an older sister, all immigrating from La Paz. Her two living grandparents are of indigenous backgrounds, both who speak the Aymara language. She is passionate about restoring and preserving indigenous cultures. She is currently working on an initiative to bring Quechua classes to the University of Virginia in hopes of learning the language herself to better communicate with the strong Bolivian presence in the Northern Virginia area and to keep her culture alive for generations. We also have Victoria Gonzales-Saldaña, who is a senior here at Penn, double majoring in biology and Latin American and Latinx studies. She was born in Mexico and grew up in South Texas. At Penn, she's a member of the Cipatil Latinx Honor Society, Penn for Immigrant Rights, the LALS Undergraduate Advisory Board, and she is passionate about immigrant rights and hopes to continue working to support immigrant communities. And last but not least, we also have Dayanna Salas, who is an undergraduate student at the University of Pennsylvania, where she intends to double major in international relationships and economics. She's interested in diplomatic economics and cultural relations between South American countries and the political involvement of indigenous communities in the Andes. Currently, Dayanna is a student co-organizer at Penn's Indigenous Latinx Project. Born in Guayaquil, Ecuador, she intends to use her education to get involved in Ecuadorian politics. So I'll start it off by asking a couple of questions in which we will go in the order of Francis, Victoria, and Dayanna. So the first question is, when you hear the label Latino/Hispanic, what roots and ethnic origins usually come to mind? What type of portrayal of indigenous groups did you grow up with? Why do you think there's an everyday emphasis on Hispanic heritage, but not indigenous or African ones? You will have 3 minutes to answer each.
So when I think of the terms Latino and Hispanic, I usually think about Latin America, Spain, Spanish. Well, for Hispanic, and like specifically, I think about the definition of what it means to be Hispanic, which is coming from Spanish-speaking country, and I think that says a lot about how we see Latin American and Hispanic countries as places where Spanish is dominantly spoken by the people, and you kind of go over and erase the indigenous language or languages that aren't often spoken by all members of the community. And when I think about it, it reminds me of the times of colonization where um, colonizers and conquistadores came to colonize these people and to force them to abandon their indigenous cultures and traditions to conform to a more um, Spanish culture that emphasizes using Spanish. And it's through this that many cultures have felt the need to abandon their own language or be embarrassed of their cultures to want to um, fit more in their society and their culture and their uh, surrounding neighborhoods that they have to speak Spanish in order to communicate with everyone. But in turn of that, they often forget that there are people who still aren't able to speak Spanish, and we lose that indigenous aspect of being Hispanic or Latino, and there's a disconnect between being identifying as a Latina or Latinx with being indigenous, because when you think of latinidad, there's so much exclusion of um, Afro Latinx persons as well, and that's a huge issue as well when you think about indigenous persons. Because when I thought about Bolivia, I completely forgot that there is a whole group of Afro Bolivians living in the country, and I think that says a lot about how we approach learning about Latinidad and dismantling the whole idea of what it is.
Thank you for that. Victoria?
Yeah, so when I hear the label Latino, Latinx, or Hispanic, I mostly think, about mainstream media and what we see when we, on Latinx television, music, movies, and it's mostly white Latinos, and people who look more like me. So I think we don't speak of, at least when I grew up in Mexico, and even in South Texas, you hardly hear people speak of their indigenous communities, the land that we're on, who it actually belongs to. Instead, you just see white Latinos, and that's kind of what dominates the conversation when it comes to Latinidad. In my experience, I don't remember really having much of a conversation of indigenous communities other than, this idea that these are ancient cultures, the Aztecs and the Mayans long time ago, they're not spoken of as actual communities that still live in Mexico, that still are discriminated against, and Afro-Latinos, at least in Mexico and in probably most of Latin America, they're not even spoken of, at all, especially in Mexico. So obviously I think Latinidad, although it, kind of creates a sense of community, at least at Penn, it still, comes from, the racist and colorist institutions in Latin America that continue to uplift white Latinos, white passing Latinos, and, but instead continue to discriminate against indigenous communities and Afro-Latinx communities. And I think that's why the emphasis on Hispanic heritage excludes these communities. Yeah.
Thank you. Dayanna?
Yeah, so for me, growing up, the terms Latino and Hispanic were foreign to me because the people around me described themselves as Ecuadorian. So I too adopted that to be my identity. When talking about non-Ecuadorians, we would refer to them by the countries that they were born in, such as Bolivian, Peruvian, or Argentinian. I did not have a sense of what it meant to be Latino or Hispanic. I was aware that Ecuador was a country in South America, and I felt a sense of unity between me and other countries in South America, but there was not really a relationship that I could identify myself with, and more so served as a geopolitical marker of our relationships. While the label Hispanic encompasses all Spanish-speaking countries, the ethnic origins that come to mind are just Spain. And the impact of Spanish colonization is still seen today for the influence of culture, traditions of language, and religion still practiced in these Hispanic countries. On the other hand, the roots and ethnic origins that come to mind when I hear the label Latino or Indigenous and Black, the term Latino to me carries a history of the people in the North, Central, and South America. This means that people that were there before the Spanish colonized or those who were untouched by the Spanish. And even today, we see an erasure of these cultures of Indigenous and Black communities in Latin America. At least from I know in my experience in Ecuador, the Indigenous community is often referred to as longos or cholos as a derogatory term to put down those communities. And then on the other hand, those of Black descent are called monos, which means monkeys in Spanish. And I think this is all because we have adopted this mentality in which the Spanish culture and the Spanish descent is of more importance. So those of white passing Latinos or white passing Ecuadorians are put on a higher standard than those that are of different colors or different races, or who may have, for example, speak different Indigenous languages. And we continue to see the harm that places on the communities and the divide that creates between different people, regardless of sharing the same nationality. We still see such a huge gap between how these people are related to each other or how they interact. And I think this is something that in the future we should look towards trying to mend or trying to investigate and really get to the bottom of.
Thank you. Yeah, that definitely resonated with me. I particularly enjoyed when you said that growing up, you have described yourself more so about the country that you were from, instead of actually like Hispanic as a whole. It was the same for me. It wasn't until I actually got to this country that I started saying I'm Hispanic. So I think that's very interesting. Very good answers to all of you. Not that there's any wrong answers, of course. So we'll be moving on to our next question. When growing up, were you aware of cultural traditions connected to Indigenous cultures? And how close or far away did you feel from it? And of course, these traditions I'm speaking of are food, music, festivities, words, practices, anything.
So it took me a while for me to recognize my own cultural roots and let alone Indigenous background through my grandparents. I've always grown up, my two first languages were English and Spanish. Now I was kind of pushed to become this like Americanized version of myself and to cherish this so-called American culture where you watch footballs on Sundays, you eat hamburgers and hot dogs, and you set off fireworks on the 4th of July. And these are things that I kind of grew up trying to like cherish. And I guess growing up as a child, I was a picky eater. Like I'd always go to restaurants and I'd always want to eat chicken nuggets and French fries, and that's the only thing that I grew up on until somehow my parents, who are strongly connected to their culture, started force feeding me these Bolivian dishes like sweet pancho or chatica, fricassé, and all these Bolivian dishes that I had never thought that I would touch until my taste developed. And even with that, I've always had both my grandparents who are still alive speak in their indigenous language, which is Aymara. And it's almost the way that I communicate with my parents and sisters, I communicate to them mainly in English. For them, it's like their own English. They speak in Aymara, and just as much as they're left confused when we talk amongst ourselves in English, we're also left confused when they talk in Aymara. And that's the earliest memory I have of being in touch with Indigenous language and hearing it in my household, but I've also been able to attend Bolivian events and witness for the first time a few years ago performances of Afro Latinx dancing in festivals and on stage, and that made me realize that there were within the Bolivian community Afro Bolivians that I had never seen before, and even when I visited Bolivia for the first time, that I saw them during a visit to um, to a part of Bolivia that you don't expect. I guess it came to me as like a surprise because my whole family was also astounded by the fact that there were still Afro Bolivians living there.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. Thanks for opening up. Victoria?
Yeah, so I think growing up, I wasn't really aware of the cultural traditions in Mexico that were connected to Indigenous culture. And I think, you know, that was done on purpose because so much of Indigenous culture was kind of appropriated and renamed as, you know, Mexican culture. You have Mexican food, you know, tortillas, tamales, atole. These are all Indigenous, you know, they have Indigenous roots, but they are retold and repackaged, you know, as Mexican to fit this kind of like nationalist identity. And so, you know, that obviously has a long historical type of roots to, you know, mestizaje in Mexico, which is this idea, you know, that, you know, mixed race and we all have Indigenous blood, and obviously a very hugely problematic take, you know, that Mexico continues to uplift and uphold, you know, the idea that everyone has Indigenous blood, because all it really does is it erases the actual Indigenous communities that live in Mexico. And, you know, white Latinos end up claiming this indigeneity and, you know, forget the, you know, communities in Oaxaca and in Mexico, you know, and instead, you know, continue to claim Spanish as, you know, the language of the country. And I think it's a really, really harmful concept that I didn't learn about until I was in college, you know, even though it's kind of ingrained in your brain. You know, I grew up in Mexico, so, you know, this was my food and this is my culture, but it's not, you know, and instead you're told that it is because it's been appropriated as so. I mean, I can think of Frida Kahlo, you know, who huge Mexican icon who appropriated, you know, Indigenous culture with her dressing and everything. And she is so well known. And you could say that has its pros, but, you know, again, that is erasing the Indigenous cultures that she took from. So yeah, I growing up, I didn't feel connected to it. And I think that was the point, and that is the point of mestizaje. It's meant to erase the communities that are there and continue to label them as, you know, some that aren't there, and that they want to continue this erasure of Indigenous communities in Mexico and claim it as Mexican when it's not.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a lot of truth in what you just said. Dayanna?
Yeah, so growing up, I was actually very aware of my Indigenous background, but that only came until I came to the United States, actually, which is, I think, kind of interesting, because when I was in Ecuador, I lived in Guayaquil, which is a coastal city, and does not have a big Indigenous community. But coming to the United States, I was able to connect with my grandmother, who was more in touch with her Indigenous roots. And, you know, she would use Quechua words, and I've adapted those, and I didn't really understand those words were not Spanish words like runa, wawa, achachay. You know, I was not aware that those were not Spanish words until a lot later on. But I think throughout the time with spending time with my grandmother, she definitely made me more aware of my culture. But I think that came later on. But at the same time, there's still like a little bit of disconnect because we are not in our home country, and we're not experiencing our culture with people of our own. So that has definitely created a disconnect. But at the same time, I've been able to enjoy my culture through things like music, San Juanitos in Quechua, or just teach it as well. that has been translated to Spanish or still have words in Quechua as well. Like artists like Gonzales-Saldaña and Huacachino, they incorporate our indigenous languages into their music, which I think is really helpful in helping spread the culture and the words and keeping those traditions alive and those traditional sounds alive as well. And recently we just had Carnaval a few weeks ago, which was really fun, and it's a shame that we weren't able to celebrate it because of the given time. But I think that is also something that we need to acknowledge, that is indigenous, or that the indigenous people have a different way of celebrating it and have their own traditions and culture that has been built into those specific celebrations and what they need. And I think that, for example, something growing up in the United States, I think I was made fun of for eating cuy, which is, I think, one of the foods that most people would identify as being like a Southern indigenous food. And I think it's really hard sometimes for foreigners to understand that some people do consume this type of animal. But I think at the same time, we should have conversations about what it means to us and like the origins from which they come, and not only how it incorporates into our food and gastronomy, but also the place that it holds in like religious practices or other cultures, such as like healing and medical practice, things like that. And then I think also our religion is something that I've been also really hyper aware of. While Catholicism is definitely something brought by the Spanish, it has been reclaimed by the indigenous community in Latin America as well, just the practices and also through the different beliefs that they have built and different practices that have built in to it, and little things, little adjustments or beliefs that have been made in order to kind of reconcile both Spanish colonization and the indigenous culture that existed beforehand. And I think that's why Latin American Catholicism is actually really interesting to see in comparison to the rest of the world, just because it is so unique and so encompassing of those indigenous roots.
Thank you, Dayanna. Yeah, I also feel very similar to what you have all said. It's actually kind of interesting for me, since I have always kind of been aware of these cultural traditions. However, I wasn't really aware that they were indigenous until I was in high school or college, honestly. Like, I just ate cuy, I listened to Huayno and like other indigenous music. I knew my family spoke Quechua, and then none of this, like, I was just like, oh, that's just Peruvian. And then it actually took a long time, and I think it actually has a lot to say, has to do with what Victoria said about the mixing. And that was the point of it, obviously. So we'll be moving on to our third and final question, and then after this, it'll be open up to questions from the audience. So our third question will be, how are you exploring and gaining awareness of Indigenous heritage? How has it changed your identity as a Latina? And does it affect the way in which you view yourself and your community?
So one way that I've been exploring my Indigenous heritage is by pursuing bringing Quechua classes to UVA, because currently one of the only Indigenous languages offered here is Maipiche, which is I believe, an Indigenous Guatemalan language. And I came to understand after years of taking Spanish and wanting to pursue a new language, I wanted to learn one that I could use to better to uplift my community and also speak with community members themselves, because I come from Northern Virginia, where there's a huge presence of Bolivians, and I've always been attending Bolivian events, festivales, kermeses, and the one thing I always hear is people speaking in Quechua among themselves. And it's a language that my family doesn't speak, but always admire because my participation in the Bolivian dance called Salas, where they're most known for playing songs in Quechua and dancing to the sounds of the charango, and these are things that kind of resonated with me and kind of motivated me to pursue learning a language that I could potentially use my college education to go back to my community and better involve myself with these individuals and help them for the most part understand the environment that we live in and be able to be a resource to them because someone as like with other Latin American countries where indigenous people are erased and are suppressed by the dominant um, Spanish culture, I want to be able to be a person that communicates and translates for Quechua speakers and makes them feel comfortable about their own indigenous culture that most of them, for the most part, have been forced to be embarrassed about because of this colonization of the Spaniards. And I want to bring this change to UVA because I know so many people are from Northern Virginia as well. And if they want to better involve themselves in a community where they're from, I think it's the best chance that we have to restore endangered language and make sure to that they understand that indigenous people exist and that they have cultures that are still important to everyone and should be respected and restored.
Thank you. Victoria?
Yeah, so I think the way I've been exploring, and hopefully gaining awareness of Indigenous communities is definitely through taking classes. I'm fortunate enough to be able to take these classes at Penn, from archaeology to Americo's Quechua class, which I'm, super lucky to be in. And it's definitely made me question more than I already had, my identity as a Latina, and especially who is benefiting from this idea of Latinx identity and who isn't spoken of and who isn't. And I think, hopefully as I learn more and as I get to have more conversations like this, we'll be able to, make small changes in our communities, right? But yeah, I think it's super important to, have these conversations and question who is benefiting from ideas like Hispanic heritage and Latinx identity. I mean, we have huge movies like Coco, right, which everyone knows, everyone has watched. And, it's this portrayal of a Mexican identity that Chicanos can now relate to. But again, like, Indigenous communities in that movie weren't spoken of, and so much of what was portrayed in that movie came from Indigenous cultures, So I think these are things to really question and hopefully continue to talk about, because instead they're just taken as, wins for Latinos when, are they? But yeah, I think representation obviously is really important, and the Latinx identity has its problems with, who is able to be represented through it. And hopefully with these conversations, we can change that.
Thank you. Dayanna?
Yeah, so I actually came to Penn with the hopes of exploring my Indigenous identity a little bit more after I found out about the Quechua Penn program. I was so excited to maybe be part of a community in which I could share my culture and explore more of the culture that has been taken away from me, I guess you could say, through colonization and through just immigration as well. So I hope to, in the future, continue to be part of the Quechua Penn program, have more events like this in which we could explore identities, have more interactive events as well, in which not only panelists, but audience members as well can, begin to explore their identities and their cultures and understand more about where they come from, because I know that that is something that our generation faces a lot, especially as like first or second gen students in university. It's especially hard to maintain these roots and maintain these cultures when you're far away from home, you don't have the constant reminder of, oh, this is something that I'm celebrating, or this is something that I am a part of, because now you are in a place where you're surrounded by people not of your culture, and it's really hard to find, especially an indigenous community within these communities. And I think that this has affected my perception of myself as Latinx or Hispanic, just because I think that through having these questions and trying to explore my identity and finding a community, I have once again explored or questioned my identity and my place within, like, what it means to be Hispanic and what my role is, and something I could do to change the future or change the realm in which we exist in. And it definitely has heightened my awareness of the indigenous community, not only in Latin America, but specifically in my country, Ecuador, with the recent political uprisings of the indigenous community. It's made me appreciate a lot more my culture and what my people represent, seeing them, get on the street and demand their political rights and demand political change, and try to combat corruption, even if they're underrepresented or they cannot necessarily express their feelings because they do not speak Spanish. I think that is something to really admire and respect, because it's very hard to be able to make an impact in the world or make an impact on the country that you care about, which doesn't seem always to care about you. That's something that a lot of, I think, indigenous communities in Latin America face. Caring a lot about their land and caring a lot about the country and being proud of where they're from, but facing the same, not feeling the same way about like their government or the way that the rest of the citizens in the country treat them the same way, because a lot of times they're not treated with respect, or they're not treated with the dignity that they wish to have. So I think that this is something that to further question and to further try to support through any means possible, whether that be in a political way or just in a social way, just continue to support these communities and uplift them to make sure that their voices are heard and that the change that they want made is effective.
Thank you for that. So now we'll be opening up to questions from the audience. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to type it out in the chat, or you can just raise your volume, introduce yourself, and ask the question. What are your opinions on indigeneity in mass media or modern consumerist cultures, like the greater prominence of indigenous identities, items, ideologies seen in the fashion or film industry? Does greater exposure always mean something positive? Is there a distinction between allyship and acquisition of identity? I think that's a great question. You guys can jump in at any time.
I actually think that almost all exposure is good exposure. I think that maybe not all the time is indigeneity and portrayed in the correct way, or is it followed to not always properly researched. But I think that even if there are some mistakes or there are some things that are missing from the stories that are being told in mass media or fashion or in the film industry, I think that it still has people thinking about it or exposed to the culture regardless. Not all the time, no, we cannot expect, or I would say we would like for this to be the case, but I don't think that we can always expect for indigeneity to be portrayed in the way we want it to or correctly. So I think that it is almost all exposure is good exposure as long as it gets people thinking and makes people question the relationships in South America or Latin America in general. I think it's important, like my fellow panelist Victoria mentioned, a movie like Coco has a lot of indigenous culture things involved in it. And I think that even if not everything was portrayed correctly, or maybe there are some gaps in the knowledge, I think that it still got people thinking about what it means to be Hispanic or what it means to be indigenous, and how I just think it gives people exposure to maybe things that they did not know of before, and it creates a lot greater appreciation for the culture.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to, you know, have that representation. And obviously I think it's even more important, you know, who is telling it and who is telling their story and who is, you know, providing the information for this representation. Although, as Dayanna said, you know, it's kind of hard to expect it to always be correct and always, you know, not be appropriation. But I think, yeah, it's important that it's out there, and it's important that we question it at times, you know, just like with Coco, you know, question why it's claimed as Mexican, and, you know, what is Mexican identity and where are its indigenous roots and what are they. And I don't know if greater exposure is always good exposure, but I think it does has its good benefits. You know, I was obviously come up with a lot of like popular media examples, but, you know, the movie Roma too, with Yalitza, who came out, and it was like obviously pros and cons to it too, because again, she was playing the character of a maid, and, you know, that still saying that's still that same stereotype, you know, but at the same time she came out as this like amazing actress. She was nominated for an Oscar, and, you know, you have those conversations that are started, you know, from this white Latino making another movie. So yeah, it's definitely a complicated answer, a complicated question, but I think it's important to prioritize questioning what we see and learning more.
I think also as well, when I was like reading up on like Quechua use and like in general, and I think an example that I remember was in Indiana Jones movie. I remember that there was this one line where Indiana Jones was referring to like another person speaking like an indigenous language, and he said something along the lines like, "Oh, that's Quechua," when really, in fact, the other person wasn't speaking any Quechua at all. And it's just this broad in mass media, indigenous shouldn't just refer to just one specific culture, that it should be referred to multiple indigenous um, communities, because indigenous is such a broad term that there could be so much. There's so many more communities within this umbrella term, and languages to explore, cultures that each have a unique one, and that the mass media, whatever that they produce, that it's also coming with good intent to not only expose it but accurately portray them. Because if we're going to move forward to or towards respecting indigenous cultures and these identities and giving them the accurate representation they need, is a key to building this respect towards them and giving them a spotlight that they deserve and is well past the need to have.
Thank you. I'll be reading the next question now. So, how do people with indigenous blood in South America and their descendants play a role in embracing indigeneity?
I think this is a great question. This is something I ask myself a lot, actually, just because I am South America and then of indigenous descendants. And I think that it is extremely important that we carry our cultures, even if it is to some extent, and even if we're not always knowledgeable of our cultures because of, you know, history that has happened, and, you know, being in the United States makes it a little bit even more difficult than it would be if we were back home. I think it is, even if you cannot embrace the culture fully because you're not aware of all the parts that go into it, I think that at least acknowledging that you have indigenous descendants is really important, just as to not muddle the narrative that has been created throughout the years, and make sure that our culture is kept alive. I think that the languages, indigenous languages in Latin America and South America, you know, with Quechua and Quechua, these are languages that are going extinct because of people not passing down their language and kind of rejecting the identity and the culture that comes with the term indigenous. So I think that it is something that we need to try our hardest to embrace, or at the very least acknowledge, for the future generations to come, just so that there's greater awareness. Because when someone at least knows that they're indigenous, I think that they have like a drive to try to do something, or, you know, even if it means like supporting a small business that's indigenous or things like that. It's just important to continue to drive the culture forward as to not make it get lost through as it moves across countries or moves across cultures. I think it is something that needs to be kept alive, and as descendants we need to try our best to be responsible as much as our parents were in passing down their knowledge of the culture, and we need to do the same thing forward, even if it's not with our kids but with our friends or in the media. Just small steps at a time can create a lot of awareness and can create a lot of respect for the culture moving forward.
Adding on as well, if you have indigenous blood running in you, it's so important to acknowledge it and to recognize that even though you weren't aware of it in the first place, or that there was something that was blocking you from acknowledging that, it's something that you should want to pursue, or a motivation to better understand your identity or your background and pursue interests that better explore the indigenous identity, because so many times people have tried to hide it in embarrassment that it's so much different than for me, like American culture, or for people in Latin America, this culture where you speak Spanish, or that you're almost modernized to this idea that you no longer need to depend on your indigenous cultures or these knowledge systems that indigenous people still practice, that still hold a great part on today, especially with agricultural systems, for example. That something that I'm learning for one of my classes that I'm in about archaeology and sustainability, how how indigenous people and their cultures and knowledge have so much influence on how cultural or cultural and agricultural systems today could function better in so many ways. And it's recognizing that these people hold so much potential to improve our well-being today, that there should be a motivation to understand why there's a need to preserve their culture, their language, their everything, because without them we wouldn't be here today.
Victoria, do you want to say anything?
Well, I am from North America, Mexican, so I don't think I have the right answer for this, but yeah, but I still think that as like a Mexican, like at least with my Mexican identity, I think it's, as I've mentioned throughout the panel, just kind of question where our culture comes from and continue to uplift indigenous communities. And I think by learning, researching, reading books and everything, I think that's a great way to start.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think it is a really interesting question. And also being from South America and a descendant, I guess, it was very interesting for me personally because like I said, I pretty much grew up my whole life being like, this is Peruvian culture. I don't know what you're talking about. And then being like, oh, wait, this is actually indigenous. I definitely had a time that I was like, I don't want to call myself indigenous. It kind of feels wrong to do that because I'm been like Latino my whole life. And there's definitely like a hurdle, and I think there's a lot of sides to it. Obviously, I don't want to appropriate, but at the same time, this is my culture, and a lot of what I can speak Quechua isn't my fault, but rather the systems of oppression that have existed in the country that have allowed for the language to not pass on from my grandparents to my parents. So I think it's this question is very interesting, specifically for the descendant role, because obviously, like Victoria was saying, indigeneity has kind of been co-opted by like as a nationalistic thing. So in Mexico and in Peru too, you have people who don't really have ties to the indigenous culture being like, oh, I'm Inca, and no context of anything, you know? And then you also, like, so that's not like the best. But at the same time, you also have people who do have these cultural ties and now are like, well, do I say I am? Do I not say I am? It's very confusing. So I think I want to say that it's always good to learn more about it. So, and to connect to your culture, especially if you have a tie, if you have a tie into that culture, it's really good to do that. And even if you don't, but you know you're mestizo, so like obviously that's coming from somewhere, you're not just completely Spaniard, it's still good to just research, even if you don't have any ties to it, I think, as long as you don't overstep your boundaries. So the next question will be, how can non-Indigenous / white Latinx folks be better allies?
I think this is a pressing question, especially in America these days, being allies of different types of communities, but specifically to the Latinx or Indigenous communities. How can people that do not identify within these communities, how can they be better allies? I think that it's just a matter of educating yourself and, you know, being aware that they exist, and, you know, not having prejudiced thoughts against it, you know, being really open-minded to the culture, and just not making judgments. I think this is really the best you can do. If it's possible, if you like a product or something like that, you know, support these people that, you know, maybe marginalized or not have the means to which to break into the market. I think these are really important things to do as well. Just support these communities as well. But I think that most importantly is just be open-minded and, you know, be open to having these discussions. Even if you don't identify with these cultures, I think that it's always important that the only way we can really move forward and, you know, really create an impact in, you know, outside of our community is to involve people that are not part of our community, you know, make them aware, make them care about, you know, our communities, so that they too can help us, you know, make change in the political realm, the economic or social realms as well. It can only be done if we have more allies. So I think that if you educate yourself, if, you know, you just are supportive of these communities, that's really the best you can do. And if you see causes that can be helped, whether that be, you know, politically or socially, or even if it's helping out a friend, or, you know, just trying to understand more about the culture, I think that's something that would really be appreciated. And I think we always need more people to, or would be grateful to have more people know and appreciate our culture.
I would say the same as well. Like, if you'd like, there's so many resources that you could look for to help better understand what it is to be Indigenous, even though you don't necessarily identify yourself as one, or you don't have any ties to any Indigenous heritage. That is something interesting to explore. Like, coming from an outside, there's so many institutions that offer Quechua as at the university, yet it's in the middle of nowhere, and people still take it because people are interested in understanding a culture that doesn't belong to them, but they see as worthwhile to study. And I also think that supporting Indigenous people themselves is such a huge important thing, especially now for during a pandemic, like supporting Indigenous business owners as well. Like, I recently made purchases from Brooklyn Wardme Designs, who sells um, necklaces, earrings, bracelets, and she's Indigenous. She doesn't consider herself Latinx for the reason that she doesn't feel like it's part of her identity, but she's Indigenous herself, and she talks a lot about being Indigenous. And I think it's me being able to follow different um, um, Indigenous people on social media as well. It kind of widens my perspective as well, because every time I see them on Instagram or on Twitter, they repost something on their story, or um, share a resource. I always look into it, because there's always something that I come out of learning something new, or finding a new business to support, and seeing how interesting they put themselves as as a person of indigeneity, and sharing their part of their culture with other people as well.
Yeah, I think something I really value and prioritize is, along with what my fellow panelists have already said, is definitely focusing on, who's telling the story and who's telling the narrative, and who's controlling that. And in this case, obviously I want Indigenous people to be at the forefront of that. And this is kind of, with a lot of issues, with immigrant rights issues with that, which I also really care about. Obviously I want, immigrants to be at the forefront of, telling their stories. So I think, as an ally, that's kind of the most important thing, to support, and then be there to, support their businesses, support telling and learning their stories, but making sure that they're at the forefront of, telling the stories.
Very nice. Okay, so we are at 9 now. If everyone's okay with it, we're gonna run a little bit over. I'm gonna answer questions. I'm gonna ask some questions. Try to finish up the questions here, and if we can just like answer them as quick as possible. If you don't feel like you really have anything to say or contribute, or like everyone has said it already, it's okay to not. So what are your thoughts as Latinx as an intersectional identifier? I see that we are using it here and it's prevalent among my peers. However, after the Pew Research report last summer, about 1/4 of US Hispanics have heard of Latinx, but only 3% use it. It has been contested in many institutions.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a kind of, I don't know if controversial is the right word, but very contested term. I think it's definitely more used more in academia, and in the US too. I've read a lot about how it's not nearly used as much in Latin America. And I've also heard that the term Latina is better. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but yeah, I think it's a difficult question. Again, I don't know what the right answer is, or if there is a right answer, but I do think it's important to be inclusive when it comes to our terms, and especially with Spanish being a gendered language. So yeah, I think this is going to be an issue that continues, and hopefully the discussion around it will kind of expand outside of academia.
Personally, I have seen the rise of the term Latinx in like these very recent years. So it's something that I'm new to, as I think many of us are also new to using this term and like incorporating it into our dictionary. I personally, like in my everyday life, I do not use it. I find myself using the word Latino to rather than the term Latinx, but I do, I understand the importance of, incorporating, different identities within the word, within the Latino community. So I think that as it was previously mentioned within the questions, specifically in Latin America, like themselves, they don't use the term Latinx. They prefer to use the term Latino to, encompass everybody. So I think that it really is up to the person to decide whether or not they identify with the term or find the need to use it, because I think it is completely valid to have a preference for either, whether, you grew up with one term and, prefer to keep the term and think that it is encompassing enough of the identities, then I think that that's really valid. But at the same time, if you think that the term Latino does not encompass all the identities that you wish it would, then I think Latinx is also a great term to use as well. I don't think there necessarily there is a better term for the other thing. It really just depends on the individual and how they wish to identify themselves or identify the community. But I think that, as Victoria mentioned, especially in academia, we see the term Latinx, rise up a little bit more. So I think that if the term Latinx continues to build momentum, I think that I am perfectly okay with that, and I think that is something great, and at least it points towards conversations of inclusivity, and I think that's really important.
I think what I absolutely hate is the fact that Latinx using the term is considered a controversial topic, because being able to be inclusive of all people with different pronouns is so important that it shouldn't be something that should be debated. Like, for example, like all of us, when you guys were introducing yourselves, you introduce yourselves with the pronouns, and as much as like we've become normalizing the use of pronouns, that using Latinx shouldn't be as controversial as much either. Even for the older generations, I understand that it's difficult for them trying to transition from not using pronouns, or just automatically thinking that a woman uses she, her, or a man uses he, him. That they're we're all growing from this. We're all growing and developing from away from that mindset that we need to refer to people as she, her, he, him. That it becomes all much more inclusive to an environment or to community that is inherently sexist, with the concept of machismo, and separating that from being able to just welcome more people, make them feel as if that they belong in the community that's separated them for such a long time.
Just making sure it is the last question. Yeah, it is. What is your thoughts on checking off Native American and demographic sections on forms?
This is actually a really interesting conversation, just because I remember when I came to the United States for the first time, I did not know how to fill out like the race section, because previously, at least in Ecuador, we don't have to check off race boxes when filling out like identification forms or any legal documents, because everybody is so mixed that it's really hard to keep track of just what is the biggest percentage of whatever race that you identify as. But coming here, I found myself, the person that helped me fill out my form had originally put me as white, but throughout the years, and after informing myself and becoming more aware of the culture that I'm a part of, I have come to accept the Native American box, just because I don't think that white alone supports or like demonstrates my identity. Just I don't identify with it at all. I don't think that it really, I just don't identify with like the white race, just because my mom is Indigenous and my father is Black. I have never seen the need to use it, but I think it is something that I was always compelled to check off, just to make it easier, and specifically because just the way that forms are built, it is just so much easier to check off white than phrase the questions of should I put Native American or should I put Black. But I know it's a really difficult question, because a lot of times when there is a Native American box, or when you check it off, it sometimes asks for the tribe, which I think complicates the question even more, right? Because a lot of times it's like, do you just put Quechua as like a tribe, or is that not appropriate? Questions like this really come up, and it's really difficult to face these questions, but I think it really is like a personal choice to do so, just because at the end of the day, where your heritage stands and how your experiences have been formed by the labels that you've grown up with. So if white just doesn't seem to fit, I think it would be really nice to question where does my heritage come from, and how have different labels, or how have my experiences shaped the way that I identify myself today. So I would say that just as I have come to embrace like the Native American box, as well as like the Black, checking off Black, because it is the other half of my identity as well. I think I would encourage other people to also really question whether they would go forth with just checking off white, or checking off maybe other boxes. And it is something difficult, especially because of like the way that the census and like different forms have been made to be checked out. But as long as you really identify with a certain identity, I think that's what really matters.
Yeah, I think, for me as a mestiza, I don't know my family tree very well. And when my, grandparents, great-grandparents, when they are spoken of, it's mostly of Spaniard heritage, or really my family only claims Mexican. So I do think it gets a little complicated when I see, I've read, the Mexicans, who immigrate recently or just are here, Chicanos, with the idea of Aztlan, sometimes like to check off Native American. And like Dayanna says, I guess it is kind of a very personal question. But in my case, I am perceived, as a white Latina. So that's what I put. Even though I think it's still like a complicated issue, because I identify, as Mexican. Yeah, I think it's a very complicated question, and I think it's important to, I don't know, have these conversations. And if you do have ties to a certain community, research it and learn about it and learn from it. And, again, these are just government forms. The United States trying to label us, so whatever. But yeah, I think it's important to, focus more on your communities and supporting your communities.
When I think about the U.S. Census and filling it out, I automatically think about what my medical records, what my birth certificate says, and it labels me as white. And as much as I hate and how much lack of white privilege that Latinx and Hispanic individuals have, kind of makes it so much more difficult to actually physically do it, because it doesn't represent who I am. But I don't also necessarily consider myself Native American either, because when I think of that word, I automatically think to my history textbooks of the people living on Northern American land, and those people are people I'm not sure if I have connections to, or if my ancestors or my descendants do. So I don't want to make the wrong assumption that I'm taking on this own identity and claiming it as mine when I'm not so sure of it myself. So when I think about that, I don't think about checking it off, because I don't want to feel like I'm taking someone else's culture and making it my own.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point that you guys have all brought up. That's pretty much how I feel as well. Like, as Latino, it always says white, parentheses, Latino, also check here, right? And it's like, well, I'm not, but it's okay, I guess. And then there's a lot of the conversation around, like, you don't want to really take Northern Native Americans' heritage either. So it's like, where the hell do we fall? So it is very difficult. I usually, like, if it asks for a tribe, then I'm like, okay, they mean Northern America, like America, like United States America. And then if it is kind of a little more open, like I have seen some that are a little more open, and where they say like South America also counts and stuff like that, then I would check it off. But again, those are not as common. So hopefully they'll be more common soon, because I think it encompasses way more people. And I think a lot of the census just like doesn't encompass a lot of people that aren't just the United States, you know? And we do have a comment from Polly C. So if you would like to unmute yourself and talk.
There we go. Am I unmuted? Does that work? Okay, awesome. Hi guys. So I actually live in Utah, and I heard about this. Like, I saw an Instagram thing and I was like, oh my gosh, I gotta join really quick before it ends. So I'm glad I was able to catch some of the conversation. A lot of what you guys say resonates with me. My dad is full-blooded Quechua native from Bolivia, and my mom is actually white. So I have a very interesting dynamic in, and I live in Utah. So there's really not a lot of a lot of diversity. And there actually is quite a bit of Bolivians here, which is awesome. But the comment I wanted to make was, with my identity, I grew up having a really hard time because my mom is white, my dad is Native, but like I never really knew where I fell. People always assumed I was Hispanic, and that term just doesn't resonate with me because my dad is not Spanish. Like he's like point something percent Spanish. He's full Native. And so, yeah, it has been hard. Like I got COVID tested a while back, and the person filling out the form said, "Are you Latino or Hispanic?" And I hate when they mesh those together, but I said yes because the Latinx term resonates with me, and I claim Indigenous Latinx is what I claim my identifier to be. And then she automatically hit the box and said white. And like without even asking, she just did that. And I was like, oh, no, you need to put Native American. And she's like, oh, that's cool, the best of both worlds. And it was just really like, I knew she was very uneducated, and but she was kind about it. And I tried to explain like, yeah, you know, and I explained a little bit. I was in a huge line, so I didn't really give her a history lesson. But for me, it's hard because people assume, even in the Latinx community, people assume if you're Latino, you're Latino. Like the intersectionality, like they don't always see, or they don't always, it's been hard. They don't always appreciate me being Indigenous and being able to be Latinx. And my mom is white, you know, so I don't forget my mom. But I would just say, like, mark what you feel is right for you. Like for me, I know what my dad went through in Bolivia. There's a lot of racism towards the Native people, what my dad had to go through growing up, for being Native. And so for me, it's important that I mark that Native American box because it is close to my heart as far as knowing my dad went through it. And even Bolivians here have said derogatory things to me about being Indigenous, being Quechua. And so, and growing up, I was made fun of for my Native nose. And now I embrace it. I embrace my features that make me who I am. So I just say, I echo what everyone said. And I would also say, you know, it's important for us not to forget what our parents or our grandparents, or even if it's further ancestry, what they went through being Indigenous people. And I heard an Indigenous person from the US say that they appreciate knowing that there's other Indigenous people in the South, like in South America, who also claim that title of being Native or Indigenous, because ultimately we all have fought a lot of the same fights, right? Colonization affected my ancestors just like it affected the natives here, you know? So I just wanted to say that I appreciate this, and I hope I can tune into more stuff like this, because it's great to feel like not alone in being an Indigenous Latinx person. So thank you all.
Thank you so much for that. Definitely, that's the whole point of this panel and everything, just to connect to more people. And I'm so glad that it actually has resonated with people. So that will be all for our questions, just making sure. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, thank you, everyone. I think Americo has some things to say as well.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Victoria, Dayanna, Frances. I think we had a wonderful conversation. Thank you for opening up and for sharing so much. As all of you said at some point, this is an ongoing dialogue with others, but also within ourselves and within our own communities. And we're not looking for fixed terms, but actually kind of like a way of walking together into this pathway. And probably the best way to do that is doing it as a community. So we really appreciate that all of you for sharing so much, and also for the audience who joined us today. This is the series of events. The next event will be on April 9th. We invite you to follow the Instagram account, Indigenous Latinx, to be aware of that. We will be also posting more information. And we also thank Dayanna, who also is a student co-organizer of this gathering, and of course, all of you for coming and joining us. And Tupananchis Kama, thank you very much. Thank you.